to introduce our next speaker. It is Professor Joya Chakraborty there online.
Yes, Dr. Yus, I'm here.
So happy to see you, ma'am, and it's indeed a pleasure. From one very accomplished women journalist to very accomplished women academician of the country. Professor Joya Chakraborty, Professor and Head Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, Tezpur University, Assam. And she has been heralding this Unicef project for a number of years. She started this in Assam about 8 or 9 years ago, and she has been with us in all our ventures that we have undertaken. And she'll be talking on reporting for media and children. She did a bachelor's in physics, master's in mass communication from Assam University, and PhD from the University of Hyderabad. Her area of interest are ICT for development, information and knowledge society, sociology of communication technology and media, gender and ICT, communication for social change, children and media participation, community media, and so on and so forth. She is a life member of the Indian Association for Women's Studies. She is associated with a number of reputed journals, including the Asian Journal of Communication and Sage Online. She's been the principal investigator for experience sharing documentation to reduce flood-related child death, capacity building for strengthening and integrating C4D approaches in development practice and pedagogy, and promotion of COVID-19 appropriate behaviors and vaccine, funded by Unicef for the period 1st May 2021 to 31st December 2021. She's involved with a number of other major projects and so many other very accomplished academic achievements. But I don't want to come you between her and the students. So over to Professor Dr. Joya Chakraborty for her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey, and I'm really worried as to how am I going to hold the interest of the students after the fabulous session by Monideepa Banerjee. So, and she has also mentioned how difficult it is for teachers to hold the attention of students during an online session. And she did such a fabulous job with so many anecdotes that she shared. But still, let me try and do justice to the responsibility that you have given me. So good evening to all the students, and I would rather say all the very bright students. I was listening to the interactions that you were having, listening to the questions that you were posing, and the rich experiences, and I would say your keen sense of observation regarding the social realities around you, which informed the various interactions you had. So my session today, I would say, won't be very experiential, though I would also try to bring in some examples as I illustrate my points. And I would try to speak specifically about reporting on women and children from a very academic point of view. And please feel free to interrupt me for any clarifications. But I would start with discussing about the theoretical premises, the specific knowledge that we have in the field, and then probably look at some applications. Will that be fine with you? Do you think there is value in talking about strategies for reporting on women and children? Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, so basically the perspective that we are going to take forward for the discussion today would be looking at these interface between women, children, and the media reporters, the media professionals, and the media per se as a domain or the fourth pillar of democracy, as we essentially call it. But look at all of it from the perspective of rights, both for women as well as for children. And we understand that when we talk about rights, as to these become the basic framework in terms of the empowerment discourse that we attach so much significance to within the entire paradigm of development. So essentially, I understand we are having this entire workshop on development journalism. And hence, from that perspective itself, I would want to emphasize more on the empowerment perspective, and from there, from the rights-based perspective, when we are talking about this interface on media, women, and children. Now, when again we are talking about, first of all, women, I would essentially say that we can look from two angles. One being that of women's representation in media. So that being where we are looking at women as subjects or the content matter of the various news items. And we were till now talking about the various ways that we are talking about issues of women, reporting on issues of women empowerment, of different schemes meant for women. So that's basically when we are talking in terms of women who are as subjects. So that's one aspect. And this is where we come to another concern, that the news stories which are about women or issues around women do not comprise a significant portion of the overall content. So there are statistics to highlight that there has been recently, maybe for various reasons, a sharp drop where we come to look at women as subjects of news. Is it so that if we are saying that the media is basically a reflection of the society, then should it be so that there should be a sharp decline on reporting about women's issues? Should reporting about women's issues become periodic? That means when there is a specific incident, so what we call as the incident-based reporting. So there is a specific incident and only then we see reporting about women's issues. We do not see women's issues becoming a segment of media, of mainstream media. So these are questions probably that we need to ask, that should it become a focus? Should developmental news reporting or reporting specifically on women's issues become a focus? But that's about news. Conversely, we also have so much of research which is going on in terms of the representation of women, the stereotyping of women as far as advertising and other realms of media content, films, and various other media content is concerned. And I believe all of you are well aware of all of that. And I'll not get into the other things, but probably contain myself to these discussions. The other way of changing this particular situation or a possibility of changing this particular situation comes from women's participation in media. Now, if I may ask you that when I say women's participation in media, what comes to your mind from that?
Yeah, ma'am, can I have share my opinion?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, ma'am. If we see like the report which you just showed right now in the previous slide, so if we see like today, if we see the women reporters, especially in broadcast media like television and all, we can see more of female, anchors. Whereas in print media and other medium, it is, declining. There is no much women's representation, even as a journalist. Yeah, so it is, I think, because of sexism, what I feel.
Sure. There is another important thing, perspective that
Ma'am,
we
may
can...
I ask,
Yes,
sorry for the interruption, ma'am.
please go ahead.
This is Kueli Kaur from Press University. So, ma'am, the question is that the confusion, as the last one who was talking, Moti, I believe, declining. But I have seen in the editorial portions of many newspapers, there are many women journalists and they're working really hard. And apart from that, as we are talking about the representation of the media of women, you have mentioned a term called objectifying, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So, if I mean, don't you think that it's almost subjectified or objectified in any manner, both the way around?
When we are talking about news content, we essentially do not get into discussions about objectification of women so much, rather than when we are looking at other forms of media content. But what I meant here is that the objective way of looking at a particular news story. So what we are looking at commercial concerns here. That was the primary point that I was trying to mention. And
Exactly, ma'am. And apart from that, in films or movies, the item songs we listen, so we always get to know the objectification of women only, right?
Yeah,
yes,
ma'am, I just wanted to put a point here. Is that like in national television, whether like Aaj Tak, English, either, Hindi channels, like women, brought, the anchors, they're mostly, they have a place, especially in the prime time reporting. But if we see in the print media and other traditional, other form of media, so they're like the editor, the chief editor, and the higher position is mostly dominated by men, if we see. So what is your opinion on that?
fantastic, fantastic. You actually took me to my next point. Uh, Let me first of all emphasize that there is statistics and there is research to highlight that women's participation in media varies across different formats. The pattern is very different when it comes to English language newspapers or vernacular language newspapers, Hindi newspapers, magazines, radio, and television. According to the media format, the if I may say, the amount of participation would be a very wrong way of putting it, but then the level of participation of women as content creators varies across media formats. While the participation in English language newspapers is comparatively less, it's far lesser in Hindi language newspapers. It's a little more in magazines, it's a bit higher again in television channels, in English language television channels. And then it is also somewhat significant in radio as RJs or as presenters. Now, why it is so? These are simple statistics, but do we interpret those statistics to say that television, being a visual media, that the women are getting more space there? Is that a factor? It might again become a sexist way of looking at women's participation in media without giving due credit to their quality, to their expertise, by virtue of which they are part of that particular media channel. So there is no specific research which tells as to why this trend is there, but this is a particular trend, and there is data to support this particular factor. So it does not become uniform across all formats of media. Essentially, women's participation is less compared to men across all media formats. Compared to men, obviously, women's participation is less. But again, as far as different formats of media are concerned, there is a stark variation. The reasons for that is for us to explore and understand. Another factor which strongly influences women's participation in media is where is that particular media house located? What type of remuneration or salary structure which is available for them? When we come to vernacular media, regional media, local media, these structures of appropriate wages or the recommendations of the wage board are not followed by various media organizations, which are regional and local media. Their structure of survival is very less. And given that, what should I say, a strong financial structure or an economic structure with which the different media houses operate, that puts women into further degree of vulnerability when it comes to their participation in a decisive role as content creators. So there are multiple factors. Now, that brings us to another question as to why are we essentially talking about women's participation? We are essentially talking about women's participation as content creators in media because we are also assuming that they are, with improved participation, they will be able to change the discourse around women, or they will be able to improve the way women's issues are covered, or when we look at women as subjects of news stories, there will be a change in that pattern. So with more participation, the representation would improve. So that's the main reason as to why we are talking about women's participation. The next point, which I believe Moti Pankam was referring to, is what we essentially talk about the glass ceiling, or what I was referring to as the decision-making role. There is, again, a lot of evidence to say that, or right here, today in the beginning of the session, we were so much celebratory of the fact that the panel members here are women, the attendees here comprise majority of women. All of you are pursuing a media course in a media department. Even I teach in a department where majority of my students are women. But when it comes to various media houses and whereby people are there in the decision-making roles, in the roles of gatekeepers. Are there women there? Does it comprise majority of women? Not necessarily only in media houses, but various other professions that we are seeing. Are there women in senior decision-making roles, managerial roles, leadership roles? So where do all of these women go? Why do they not climb up the ladder to achieve those positions? Is it so that all these women who are probably performing so well in these different academic institutions, where do they land at? So that's another query that probably we will need to have in our mind, and we will need to ask if we are talking about women's representation and women's participation in media houses or in media as such. Would anybody else want to have some reflection on this or share any experiences on this?
Yes, ma'am, you have pointed out a very important issue, like mostly, in media, education, like in many universities, even I have seen like most of the girls are enrolled, especially for master's program, since it's an interdisciplinary program again. So yeah, it is a big question which we need to ponder upon and think very critically why it is, they cannot climb up the ladder. It's a very important point, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Moti. Anyone else who would want to reflect on this? Okay, so let me share again.
And ma'am, even in the, like Press Club of India, like those very like organization in media organizations, say state-wise, regional, or whether national media organization, in every agencies or organization, even there, like there is very less representation of, women.
Yes, very true. So that also comprises in terms of the decision-making roles that we were referring to. So is my screen visible to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so according to an analysis on gender inequality in Indian media by UN Women, in India, there is a disparity between the men and women in holding top leadership positions like editor-in-chief, managing editor, executive editor, bureau chief, or input-output editor in media organization. And we see the stark difference again in terms of newspaper, magazines, television news channels, and digital portals. So yes, women are overall less, but still we have to keep in mind that across the different media formats, there is a variety when it comes to women's participation in media organizations and their taking up of leadership roles. Again, there comes the incentives that women get. So women journalists, as compared to their male counterparts, get less chances in content creations. And probably they are covering more soft stories. Again, research data to highlight that. And what I was referring to a little earlier, that in terms of the differences across different media houses in English newspapers and Hindi newspapers. So these are just some statistics to highlight these differences about which we need to be concerned about and probably understand as to why this difference happens. We see more participation of women in digital media and radio, probably because of the flexibility that is offered by digital media today, that many women are part of it. Again, my comment here is not supported by data, but then we need to understand as to why this variation is there. Now, coming to the next point, which is about women and ethical lenses of reporting in media. That's again a topic which has been discussed in detail also by my previous expert with very good anecdotes. So I will not go into the specifics of it, but then still take you through an overview of the different guidelines which are available for reporting on cases of violence against women. These are some guidelines. So as media students, we need to be aware about these various guidelines. Different UN organizations have put forth some of these guidelines that the content should ideally provide call to action, including information about locally available support services. Now, important thing here is that many of us, we are aware about that identities need to be protected, but the tone of the story, are we talking about specifically about the vulnerability of the victim? Are we looking at the vulnerability of the victim, or are we talking about a person who has been a victim of some violence, gender-based violence, as a survivor? So the tonality of the news presentation is also very important for various reasons. Number one, obviously the ethical considerations are there. There is also that what sort of an impact it is going to have on other women. Probably if someone is waiting to talk about a particular violence, how it is going to impact that person. How does it shape the general perception about violence against women is another very important perspective. So the language and the way we present the story is also very important. So highlighting the actions of the perpetrator in the description of the violence, avoid making the perpetrator invisible. That's another important way, that just the story concentrates and talks about the particular victim and does not talk about the perpetrator, does not talk about the circumstances where it happened, but just about that something has happened. Many a times what we also see is that on many occasions in various media houses, it just becomes a standalone news, and then we do not see a follow-up, we do not see media reporting, providing a particular support to news stories. So these are probably issues which will change if women are reporting on those. And we also understand that there is a political economy surrounding media houses, which influences the way that reporting happens. Many a times there are various reasons as to why a particular story gets reported and there is a follow-up reporting which is happening on it, and certain occasions as to why certain stories are not followed up adequately. So being sensitive to those concerns and then operating with judiciousness is something that all media professionals will have to take note of. So these guidelines are not only there by international organization, but even Press Council of India has such different guidelines. I will not again go so much in detail, but then coming to the next focus, which is about children. Now, before I go to reporting about child rights or talking about children or reporting on children in media, one thing which becomes very important for us to understand here is that why are we talking about reporting on children or reporting about women? The previous session was on reporting on social issues. Now, when we are talking about developmental journalism, it's very important that media discourses highlight about the different marginalized sections in the society. We understand that media essentially has this responsibility to talk about social issues, to highlight the issues of the marginalized who are probably in need of certain facilities or certain services, or their rights are being hampered in one way or the other, compromised in one way or the other. This sensitivity of reporting on issues of women and sensitivity when we are talking about reporting on children, what it does is that probably it gives us a framework to keep in perspective the concerns of the minorities, the concerns of the marginalized sections of the society while we are doing our reporting. So this sensitivities will go around and probably be taken forward while we are talking about various other marginalizations as well, be it forms of gender marginalization, social marginalization, economic marginalization. So the way of reporting about the fringes is giving us that lens, giving us that sensitivity that we will be able to talk about the various fringe communities with sensitivity and keeping in mind that we are not encroaching upon their rights and that we are providing adequate space and representation to them and their issues. So the child rights as such is subsumed within the overall human rights, and they look after the requirement of children as per their age, fragility, and specificity. So essentially, which means that children, according to their growth, according to the maturity that they have achieved, we are supposed to report about children's issues, and the same concern in terms of representation and participation is there when we are talking about reporting on children's issues as well. The most important document, convention, or the structure that we probably need to be aware about while reporting about children's issues is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is also popularly known as the UNCRC. So this document, adopted by United Nations in November 1989, has been ratified by 196 countries and is a document which is binding for the various signatory nations to ensure these rights for all the children. So it's a responsibility of all adults and all governments to ensure these rights for the children. So these set of rights, this set of 54 articles which are there within the UNCRC, has some general principles which tries to talk about non-discrimination, which tries to say that every activity, every governance, everything that is done for children should be in the best interest of the child, that every child has a right for survival and development, and right to be heard. So these are the general principles. Moreover, the other articles can broadly be divided into three categories, which are survival and development rights. That is the basic right to life and achieving one's full potential. That means what their right to education, their right to survival, everything gets subsumed in the survival and development rights. Next comes the protection rights. That means how they are to be protected from all forms of harm, which again is talking about their safety. And then the next set of rights are in terms of the participation rights. And this is probably the aspect which is most significant when we are talking about media. So we need to be concerned about the right to participation of children, where they are able to talk about issues concerning them. Again, one question, if I may pose to you, is that how often have you seen that children's issues are reported in the media? How often have you seen that when we are talking about any particular news story which involves children, we actually hear the children speaking? Does mainstream media provide opportunity to children to talk about issues that concern them? So can I have some reflections from you on that? Anyone? And did it ever bother you? Because we somehow believe that when we are talking about objectivity, that every side will be heard. But what about the side of the children to be heard?
Ma'am, may I?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Ma'am, I haven't seen when any child abuse or any sort of they're working. The children are working in hotels or restaurants or everything. The owner of the shop, they're literally abusing them, and there's humdrums going on. And most importantly, we never able to see any sort of bite from their end. Like the children, like they have the freedom of speech also, and we forget that, and we never come to know about their end, what they are going through. They are actually opting for the profession of that because of they need money. They take the burden of the family to run the family, but the abusive nature of the owner of any restaurant or shops, I have never seen that.
Yes, Kuheli, this is one perspective where you are talking about crimes against children. So you are talking about probably child labor or child sexual abuse. So
Exactly, ma'am. Child labor. Yes.
yes. So these are occasions where we are looking at certain crime or violation of the rights of the children. Let us look at something very different. Like we were talking a little while earlier about the Anganwadi centers. We talk about the various problems in terms of the midday meal scheme. We were listening to issues that how during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the schools closed, it was having an impact on the nutrition of children. It was having impact on their health, their levels of nutrition, their levels of education. We were talking about the perils of online education and how successful or unsuccessful it has been. And many a times we will see so many experts talking on these issues. But how often do you see children actually taking part in that discussion? How often do we care to ask from children as to how it is impacting their lives? What do they think about it? So while everybody else has a voice, media kind of avoids giving a space to children while they are talking about an issue concerning children. So on most occasions, we do not see children coming on screen to talk about it. Yes, obviously, Kuheli, when we are talking in terms of situations of crime, then there are again certain specific guidelines which need to be followed as to again protection of identity of the child, consent of the child, and I'll be coming to those guidelines immediately now. But even on other issues, we know about a child-centric budgeting. So in that child-centric budgeting, as to how much of our entire union budget or state budget for that matter, how much of fund has been allocated for children. So these are certain important issues, and if we are talking about development discourse, we are talking about roads, we are talking about displacement, we are talking about migration. So do we see children talking about their experiences? Do we want to listen to that? What are those spaces which are available? So that's basically in terms of right to participation, right to talk about issues concerning their lives. So that's a very, very important discourse, which is becoming more relegated to alternative media spaces, and mainstream media is yet to provide appropriate opportunities for that. So again, just a little bit of an elaboration on the various rights. Another important law or provision that media students need to be aware about is the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015, which talks about primarily children or juveniles in conflict with law. So some very basic principles which are very similar to the ensuring of the rights of the child, like principle of presumption of innocence, principle of dignity and worth, that the dignity of the child needs to be upheld. It needs to be shown through all procedures that that they are important sections of our society. And the principle of participation of children and the best interest of the child, principle of family responsibility, principle of safety, all positive measures to be taken, non-stigmatizing of children, non-waiver of rights, that means under no condition the basic human rights or child rights can be compromised under any provision, principle of equality and non-discrimination, right to privacy and confidentiality. So all of these are part of the Juvenile Justice Act. And all journalists need to be aware about this when they are reporting on issues where children are in conflict with law. And being aware about the provisions is extremely important. And these are all there are a lot of similarities that we see in terms of the child rights, the UNCRC, and the provisions of the JJ Act. Now coming to the specific guidelines about reporting on children, this is a Unicef document which is there, which provides an elaborate guideline. And it's very important for all journalists probably to have a look at it in terms of while they are reporting on children and the things that need to be ensured while reporting on children. So media reporting on children and young people should never put them at risk. And this guideline or this set of guideline has 6 overarching principles, 6 guidelines for interviewing children, and 7 principles for reporting on children's issues. So basically, it is talking about overarching principles. It's talking about guidelines of how to interview children and then how to report on children's issues. So again, the principles are the overarching ideas, which talks about respecting the dignity and rights of the child under all circumstances, giving importance to the right to privacy and confidentiality, having they're giving them a voice to participate in decisions affecting their lives, protect the best interest of the child and ensure the protection of the right of the child, and then acting every time while keeping the best interest of the child in mind. That means reporting on children, we need to arrive at a balance as to, okay, there is a news story which is happening and it's important to report on it. There is the idea of objectivity, but surmounting all of that, a reporter needs to keep in mind the best interest of the child. So the guidelines for interviewing children is talking about more in terms of taking permission from elders, explaining to them in the local language regarding the implications of the interview, not stigmatizing the child, not discriminating against the child in terms of sex, race, religion, status, educational background. So if not to show any discrimination between children of different categories, understand the context, and in no way, if it is harmful for the child, reveal the location of the child, reveal the identity of the child. And we were hearing interesting anecdotes about it a little while ago. And then the 7 guidelines on reporting on children's issues, that in no way it should further stigmatize a child who has been at the who has received any sort of violence or any sort of abuse or exploitation, and to keep again the best interest of the child and not to bring any psychological trauma or harm to the child while reporting on children. And when it's also important to give definite space and reveal the identity of the child when we are talking about certain achievements, then also it's important to talk about and give due space to the achievement of that particular child. So these are just some specific guidelines that we need to keep in mind while reporting on women and children. And probably this framework is also going to help us that if we are looking for some research-based reporting, if we are looking for data to support our news stories, then all of these perspectives is going to inform our reporting. We will look for story angles which probably nobody else is going to look for. When you are a sensitive journalist, when you are aware about these different legal provisions, you will also be able to identify a different storyline. These perspectives will ensure that if you intend to become a developmental journalist, that you will report on development issues, then these an understanding of these guidelines, an understanding of these legal provisions and these ethical perspectives is going to enrich your perspective, that when you are searching for a story, when there are so many other stories, this will help you to identify the most important story that needs to be talked about. It will help you to look at things that probably others are ignoring. And that is where probably the most important development stories are there. Someone will talk about tourism, someone will talk about probably the ecology, someone will talk about the interfaces between the promotion of tourism and the displacement of people, the global impact of globalization on particular cultures. It will talk about the interfaces between environment and the community. So talking about the rights of the child and women, these are two specific perspectives. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that once we have that bent of mind to look for something else, to look for the omissions, to look for where the rights are being infringed upon, then that is going to enrich us as developmental journalists. We will learn that what are the things which probably are left behind in a mainstream discourse and probably needs to get highlighted if we are opting for social change and development. So I see Tuhin raising hand. Tuhin, do you have a question? Tuhin, do I have a question from you? Okay. Akanksha, do you want to ask anything?
Yes, ma'am. So, good evening. First of all, I'm from Assam University, Odisha. So, actually, my question is a little bit different from the topic, but it's connected to topic. So, I was asking, there is a rule or article that prohibition of child labor, but as in India, we know that small children and also there are very poverty and they tend to work intensely from on their own and not forced. So I think what's your opinion about forced labor, child labor, and like normal child labor and being forced and not forced but they are willingly doing that?
Okay, I think it's a very complicated situation. And when we try and say, okay, they're working on their own and nobody has asked them to work, but they're working on their own. And we try and say that uh, that's not a problem. Like if they're working on their own, nobody is forcing them, it's their option. But if what we need to probably understand here is that what is happening because of that. The child is losing out on childhood. The child is losing out on education. The child is losing out on future opportunities. So we can understand that the child is working or acting at that point of time according to his or her level of maturity, his or her level of understanding, and an understanding which is a outcome of the child's socialization process, the circumstances the child has seen as part of his growing up. But it is important that this child, in order to have a better future, has to be part of the education system. And the vulnerabilities that the child is getting exposed to by becoming a part of the child labor force, the child needs to be protected. So the right to protection of the child, being protected from all these vulnerabilities, it's important for the state to ensure it. So no matter as to whether the child is working out of his or her own will or the child is being forced, it's important that child labor needs to be stopped and that children should become part of the education system and that their growth and development is ensured. So it does not actually make any difference as to whether the child is working on his or her own accord or being forced.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Do we have any other question?
Yeah, ma'am. So, ma'am, regarding Child Labor, Prohibition Act of 1986. So, if we see like in Indian context, and it's not only in India, I believe in many other parts of the world, especially the third world countries, child labor is a very big, it's a very big challenge because if we say practically in India, it is like not possible because many cannot sustain livelihood, so they have to send their children for supporting kind of earning some earning for the household. So this is a very big challenge. And if we even see the sustainable development goals of 2030. So if we see the 17 goals, so it is very, very impossible, according to my personal observation in our country's, India's context. So it is something very, it will be very difficult to achieve. Maybe after many years, maybe it could be possible, what I believe. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, very true. That's the reason probably that on many occasions, various social organizations try to create a situation that yes, the child is actually part of some labor force, but then it does not impact his health, and he's not part of a particular any labor force which is harmful for his health or safety, does not put his life at risk, and he is able to do it while still being part of some sort of education or vocational training or livelihood training. So there is a balance that we cannot probably overlook the entire social realities that we are part of, the socio-economic realities that we are part of, but then that is done while keeping in view the best interest of the child. So this balance, various social organizations which are working with children, with street children, and other children with vulnerabilities, try to arrive at that balance, that the rights of the child are upheld while still the social and other economic realities are kind of taken account of simultaneously.
Ma'am, I just have something. I want your suggestion. Like children are underrepresented in media. So, ma'am, how can we, as a media teacher, educator, and media students, and media professionals, how can we, bridge this thing, shortcoming? Like, because obviously the children are, underrepresented. So, any other measures, your personal suggestions, ma'am?
Well, there are various interesting experiments which are happening, sometimes temporarily in mainstream media, but quite a lot in alternative media platforms where marginalized children and other children who are in school or who are out of school. So there are various experiments which are happening for media participation of children, or participatory media initiatives which are there with children, like the Butterflies Children's Experiment, which is there in Delhi. We have Peace Gong and other initiative. Obviously, a lot of struggle has happened for these initiatives during the COVID-19 pandemic. And recent data I'm not aware of, but there are various such other national as well as regional experiments which are happening in participatory media experiments involving children. So these are children's media content where children talk about issues at their localities, and on many occasions they are also part of children's parliaments that they form at a local level, and they are able to influence decisions at the panchayat level, and they are also able to influence decisions at the district level. So various experiments are there. On many occasions, such experiments have been supported by Unicef in the initial phases, and they have also been taken over by the district administration. So such alternative media experiments are there, but sustained experiments in mainstream media are rare to see. But yes, many other temporary experiments, I can say, have happened in mainstream media as well. So as of now in India, it is mostly situated in the alternative media spaces, not in mainstream media.
Ma'am, can I have a question? May I ask?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Ma'am, as I have told earlier regarding the child labor factor, they are a kind of, forcefully doing that to run their family economically, backward classes, right? And apart from that, I would just like to ask for you if you kindly enlighten about the film Slumdog Millionaire. If you kind of brief about it, that how Jamal did survive by, pickpocketing or selling goods over the trends. They have lost their parents and both the brothers, and after winning also, later on also they were like, in the trends, they were I mean চুরি করছিল লোকজন, এরকম একটা ব্যাপার ছিল, সেটাই একটু যদি ব্রিফ করেন কাইন্ডলি. So, and they were obviously not children, they were teenagers actually, 18 years old, Jamal was. So, if you kindly brief out. Thank you.
Well, speaking about films, that is a very different discourse altogether as to how films represent issues of child labor, and if those are being romanticized, that's a very different discourse altogether, I would say. That as a film, Slumdog Millionaire, though it was trying to have a realistic representation of some of the socio-economic realities of India, but I believe we will have to have various other specific film analysis perspectives to look at the cinematic representation of child labor and the socio-economic realities that it was trying to uphold. So this particular discussion that we are having, it's more in terms of the realistic media representations or news representation, or talking about current affairs, talking about lived realities. But whereas when we talk about films and cinematic representation, and if we are to talk about film criticism, specifically on Slumdog Millionaire, which operates at multiple levels of author theory, as well as the narrative, and as well as the discourse and realism. So every film theory perspective will probably bring us to a different interpretation of the movie and its narrative. So that would take us way beyond our current scope of discussions. And
Yes, ma'am. I can understand. Thank you so much for this insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Go ahead. I think we have exhausted the time. I can see Dr. USP and Sucharita with their camera on, which is probably an indication that we have exhausted the time. So thank you everybody for your questions, and it was nice interacting with all of you. Again, I'm not so sure as to how successfully I have done the difficult job of doing an online interaction on this particular topic, but nonetheless, thank you, Dr. USP, Snehashishda, and Sucharita for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Joya Chakraborty, for another enlightening conversation, and I'm sure this was very interesting, and we could see students interacting from various vantage points. So thank you again for your support to this workshop and to all the things that we do, and hope to see you at our future ventures as well. Thanks to students for all the interactions. So time to take your permission for the valedictory session. We have a valedictory session right now, and thanks again, Professor Dr. Joya Chakraborty, for putting across this entire spectrum into a kind of a capsule presentation. So thanks again.